Patrick T. Redig is a professor emeritus of the Avian Medicine and Surgery, College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota. He is the co-founder, former director, and head clinician of the Raptor Center. He received his bachelor's from the St. Cloud State University, his DVM in 1974, and PhD in 1979 from the University of Minnesota. He is the author or editor of numerous books, book chapters, and hundreds of presentations and peer-reviewed articles on a wide array of avian medicine and surgery topics. He also advised and mentored a large number of graduate students and veterinary externs at TRC, some of which may be here today. In 2012, he received the Practitioner of the Year Award from the MVMA, and in 2015, the Practitioner of the Year Award from the Association of Avian Veterinarians, of which he is an honorary life member. He is also a lifetime honorary member of the North American Falconers Association, reflecting a lifelong interest in the art and practice of falconry. He also served as a member of and veterinary advisor to the USFWS California Condor Recovery Program, and was the coordinator of the program to restore the peregrine falcon to the upper Midwest. Having retired in 2018 after 45 years of service, he lives on a small farm in Scandia, Minnesota. It is my pleasure to introduce you guys to Dr. Redig.
Thank you, Mari. I think you better fact check that thing. Well, listen, I am just overwhelmed. I'm so delighted to be here, but overwhelmed to see so many people coming out on our beautiful fall afternoon on a Friday, no less, and especially see many friends from a long time ago, faculty, laboratory people that I worked with. We have the former dean of the college here, Jeff Klossner, who he and I worked together on a lot of stuff over the years. Julie Ponder, our former director of the Raptor Center here. Lori Arndt, you're back there someplace now, the current director. Jean Danette, who was a faithful lab technician for me for many, many years in my lab here, and just so many others. It's really great. And you know, we're here celebrating the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Raptor Center. It is surreal, and it's sobering, and it's amazing. It's just hard to imagine. That's what's been the fun part of putting this talk together, is going back and trying to imagine where we were and what we were doing 50 years ago. And the fact that we're still here today, 50 years later, to be able to talk about it, it is pretty incredible. But the other thing too is, you know, I think what I'm particularly proud of and feel really good about is I feel like we're fundamentally a part of the College of Veterinary Medicine. You know, a couple of years ago, the college celebrated its 75th anniversary. Raptor Center has been for 50 of those 75 years almost. And I think that's a pretty amazing thing. And from what I can tell, both based on kind of analyzing and surveying the landscape, as well as knowing the people that are at the Raptor Center right now, it's going to be here for another 50 years and probably 100 years beyond that, I think. So good job, guys. And we're just going to kind of take a few minutes here tonight to walk you through, I call this our creation story or our origin story here. I'm not going to talk a lot about what's going on currently because I haven't been there for the last 6 years, but I know a lot about what happened 50 years ago, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that because, you know, you go over to the Raptor Center now, it looks like a pretty slick operation over there. I mean, you got a nice building, you got equipment, you got facilities, you got people that know what to do and so on and so forth. Think, well, that's pretty nice. That's good stuff. We're going to take you back and show you where we started because you just don't land here like we are today in this day and age. And it took a while to get there. And the work of a lot of people. I'm going to talk about things that, you know, I want you to appreciate. This is a large collective of we that I'm talking about when I talk about what the Raptor Center is, how it came to be and what it has accomplished and what it's done, because there have been so many people that have been involved and contributed immensely to the work that's being done over there and the success that we've had. Okay, so, well, first of all, I just want to restate for you, and then we'll be coming back, this is a theme of the talk, you know, what the mission of the Raptor Center is. We adopted this mission statement many, many years ago, but I think it actually captures very accurately what we do and why we do it, and it's still relevant today as it was back when. And that is to ensure the health of raptors and the world we share with them through the tripartite mission of the university of teaching, research, and service. And we also wanted, through this medium of the Raptor and what we do is connect people to the natural world and help them become empowered and engaged in their own lives in doing good things for raptors in our environment. And the raptors are a great vehicle for doing that because they capture people's imagination. They inspire them, and it captures their kind of something inside their soul that makes them want to go out and do things. I've certainly felt that, and I think anybody else that's worked at the Raptor Center would agree that happens to you when you're there. I see some of our volunteers that are here today. We have over 300 volunteers at any one point in time, and over the years we've had many thousands, and I think every one of them would probably say the same thing. We have some people like Marsha Walker-Stuffer, who's been with us for 38 years, every Wednesday morning without fail. That's a pretty amazing commitment, and you see that over and over all the time. But why do we need to worry about ensuring the health of raptors? You look around the world right now, there's going to be a lot of raptors. In fact, we're living in a golden age of raptors. There's probably more raptors around now than there have been any time in the last 100 years. That's not an exaggeration. But it wasn't that way. Back in the 60s and 70s, when I was coming of age and growing up, the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, and the osprey in particular, they were gone. In the case of the peregrine falcon, the last peregrines nested in Minnesota in 1962. And by 65, they were gone from the entire eastern 2/3 of the United States and in the southern portions of Canada, just a remnant population left in the West. The bald eagle, there was fewer than 500 bald eagles in all of the continental United States. Now, Canadian and Alaskan populations were still quite large, but we'd lost a lot of eagles here. The osprey was gone, and many other raptors that don't get much attention, such as the merlin and the Cooper's hawk, both bird-feeding falcon raptors, they were also gone too. And the problem was a single one, it was DDT. Introduced right after World War II, poison that affected the reproductive system of these birds. It's an environmental poison that passed up the food chain and caused them to lay thin eggshells. And in short 20 years, we had population crashes. Along with that, there was habitat loss. And then there was this big problem of public knowledge and attitudes. I mean, for the most part, people were either, except for a small select group of people, bird people, falconers, and others that really knew raptors and loved them. The public was either ignorant about them completely, or they just had a bad attitude about them. They were something to be persecuted, to be shot on sight, destroyed in various and sundry ways. They're basically regarded as vermin. And I grew up with that as a kid up in northern Minnesota with my friends around and things like that. I mean, it was a big thing to go out and shoot a hawk someplace. We had other pesticides that were used in rampant fashions that also entered the food chain. And we were really living not only with regard to raptors, but with many other things, and what I refer to as the ghosts of this manifest destiny concept that was really kind of the ruling program for our country from the time of the European settlement all the way up until fairly recent times. Well, that manifest destiny idea, it was a dense idea, believe me, had led to the great auk was gone, the passenger pigeon, the last passenger pigeon died in a zoo in Connecticut in 1915. That was Martha. And you have to think about that because back in the 1890s, 1900s, there were hundreds of millions of passenger pigeons living through southern Minnesota and Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. They were shot out completely. That was it. Whooping cranes are almost gone. Trumpeter swans had been shot out of the state back in the early 1900s. The buffalo and the condor were in bad shape, as were indigenous peoples. But this was all the manifestation of the concept of manifest destiny, a wrong-headed idea if ever there was one. But nonetheless, we saw the impact of that with our raptors. Well, then in the early 70s, there was this awakening of an environmental consciousness. And I think there was a silent majority of people out there that really thought, this is not right. This is not the way we should be doing this. But we don't feel empowered to do anything about it. But they started getting a voice. We had the first Earth Day in 1970, thanks to Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin. This led to organochlorines, and I shouldn't say that did, but other actions led to the banning of DDT and other organochlorine pesticides in 1972. Migratory Bird Treaty Act with Mexico and Canada in 1973 that brought raptors as a migratory bird under federal protection. Up to that time, as late as the late 1950s and early 60s, the federal government, along with several states' governments, were still paying bounties on some raptors, like goshawks and great horned owls. In Alaska, they paid bounties on bald eagles because they were eating salmon. Oh, but those salmon were dying. They'd already spawned out. But that's what the eagles were eating. mistake, we just didn't know. Anyway, so that was needed. And then we had the endangered species legislation passed, the Endangered Species Act, which brought about protections for a number of species, and is still active to this day. The peregrine falcon was the first species that was listed on the Endangered Species Act, and happily, some years later, it was the first species to come off the endangered species list because it had recovered, as opposed to going extinct, which someone did actually. Won't go there. So that was in that ferment and that framework that the Raptor Center really had its beginnings. And we have our official date of inception was July 1st, 1974. We operated out of the basement of a condemned building here on the corner of Fitch and Gortner, old veterinary anatomy. Long since gone, thankfully. But something caught fire. We had the people at the WCCO and KSTP and whatnot on speed dial, and we could bring them over anytime we needed to get video imagery of what was going on with the raptors that we were receiving. And this led to national attention almost immediately, which helped us a lot. We established a board of advisors in 1982, and shortly thereafter they said, you know, what you guys need is your own building. And this was a process that was driven largely by Don and Louise Gabbert of the Gabbert Furniture, people now known as the Galleria. And so the plans were laid to build a Raptor Center building. Architect's sketches here, just some construction pictures during the winter of 1987. Great time to be pouring concrete and building a building. If you look here, actually just over the top of this foundation, here's the old veterinary anatomy building that we used to be in. We're just on the back side of that. But a year and a half later, we had this lovely building that we've been operating out of for the last 36 years. Now, a couple of things, just stepping back from it, kind of guiding principles or things that have always inspired me when I think about them. I have a couple of quotations here, and I just wanted to share those with you. One, Victor Hugo's statement that nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And I truly and fundamentally believe that contributed a lot to the success of the beginning of the Raptor Center. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And then there's anthropologist Margaret Mead's statement that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I really believe that has been operative with the work we do at the Raptor Center. So here we have a couple committed, I'm not sure thoughtful, but at least committed individuals here that started the Raptor Center, Dr. Gary Duke and myself. Picture taken back in about 1974 when all we had to operate with was a crude wooden table and a couple of forceps and scalpels and things like that. It wasn't great, but it's what we had, it's what we worked with. Now, Gary was a faculty member here at the college. He was originally a graduate of Michigan State University, where he got his PhD in physiology. And he arrived at the university here in 1967 and established a research program in gastrointestinal physiology. He was working with poultry, but the thing that Gary really loved in life was owls. Owls were his thing, front and center. He was also a very ardent bird watcher and a conservationist. And so he and I were of like mind in terms that we saw things going on with raptors that we didn't understand, we didn't like, we really wanted to change it. And he was keen to get going on something like that. Myself, I've had a lifelong fascination with raptors. My memories go back to the 4th grade, or maybe even before that. I don't know where they came from, but I've just always loved them. I started practicing falconry when I was about 14. And like any falconer, you know, we just absolutely think raptors are the most amazing, fantastic, beautiful. The superlative adjectives that we want to apply to them are endless, but they're just the most amazing creatures on the face of the earth. And I was just, even as a teenager, I was just madder than hell when faced with the wanton destruction of raptors that was just part and parcel of what was going on all the time. And this really gave me a passion to want to do something with my life to try to mitigate that. So I came to vet school here in 1970 and graduated in 74 and really developed a commitment to develop Raptor Medicine because it did not exist at that point in time. The best we had to go with were every falconry book that's been written always had a little chapter in the back on medicine. And it didn't matter whether it was written in the 1700s or the 1900s or in 2000. Yeah, get out your peppercorns and your salmoniac and your hot sticks to burn lesions off of feet and things like that. It just had not changed in 400 years. And there was nothing that we had, that we had much to work with. But I had a good education here at the University of Minnesota. The college was great. I had good fundamentals in what we needed to do to go forward with our work, and so we did. But it's interesting to take a look that in the beginning, what did we have to work? Well, we had none of the following on this slide. We didn't have any reliable anesthetic agents. We didn't have parameters for clinical pathology, either in chemistry or hematologies, no anatomical radiology references, no established orthopedic procedures. Endoscopy existed only in the form of take an otoscope with a little spout on it if you wanted to look at something, but that was not great. Nothing for fluid therapy protocols. Antibiotics, such as they existed back and then, consisted of tetracyclines, penicillins, and aminoglycosides like gentamicin. Just practically toxic in their own right if you start giving them to birds. And we learned a lot about that. And there were many other things. And so, these were the headwinds that we were facing, having to develop a lot of this stuff from scratch and learn the hard way. And so our pathway to all this, really, part of it, had to overcome some established dogmas that are out there. People kept telling me, well, you just can't do that. You shouldn't do it that way, that way. Well, it turns out those dogmas were not really based in good science or good faith, particularly as it applied to birds. And we had to kind of rework some of that. We adapted a lot of existing methods and protocols, but we certainly developed a lot of new techniques. Largely, we were just trying to make order out of chaos because that's what it felt like at the time. And add to that a good dose of perseverance, and in time things worked out. Now, one of the clear advantages I think that we had in doing this is our caseload was what I'm calling it unattached. And what I mean by that is these birds didn't belong to anybody. They came in, they were injured, they needed care. We didn't have to go to an owner and ask, can we do this? Can we have your permission to do that? And who's going to pay for this, and so on and so forth. That was a big problem, but that's another issue. But, we were free to do what we wanted to and what we could do. And so there was lots of opportunity for experimentation, which we did. And even if the bird died, which a couple of them did along the way, we had the carcass that we could use for anatomy. We could use it for practicing other techniques that we were trying to develop, and so on and so forth. There was really no part of them went to waste, whether one way or the other. So that was really a great opportunity. And so some of the things that we developed from scratch were just even the fundamentals. How do you do physical examination on a bird, especially one that wants to bite you or grab a hold of you with its feet? Auscultation with the stethoscope, with the air sacs that they have in them and just their general anatomy. It's a different program than it is with any small mammals. Hematology, serum chemistry, radiology, endoscopy, and ophthalmology, to mention a few, really had to be developed from the ground up. And then as far as clinical disciplines, we started out with injectable anesthetic agents, moved to gas anesthesia. Analgesia was not a thing at all. Actually, that's only about in the last 15 years that we've gotten on top of analgesia in birds. Orthopedic procedures, big topic for us, and I'm going to talk a little bit more extensively on that in a minute. Bandaging protocols, and then treatment for specific avian diseases. And aspergillosis is a fungal disease that I'm going to talk about a little bit more here, but that is really the bane of our existence. And it is for anybody that's keeping wild raptors in captivity. It's always a problem and something that you have to be on guard for in dealing with right from the get-go. As we learned along the way, lead poisoning from spent ammunition has been a huge problem that's still with us. We didn't realize what it was when it first started, but in due course, it came to be known as underlying a lot of the mysterious problems that we were having with birds that we just couldn't quite figure out. And then reconditioning and release preparation. Lori Arndt has done a tremendous amount of work with that over the years, published a book on it and things, and we brought that up to a level where when we release a bird back to the wild, we know that thing is in absolute peak physical condition and is going to survive when it's released. In fact, I was just noting the other day in that newsletter of the Raptor Center, they readmitted a red tail that had been released 20 years ago. Still out there going strong. So they do make it. We've got all kinds of instances of birds that have made it again. So lots of stuff there. Also, when you think about how avian medicine developed, we didn't do this in a vacuum. Late 70s, early 80s, and into the 90s, there was a lot going on in avian medicine, avian and exotic medicine. These were kind of coming into their own in the veterinary profession. But all the way around, there's quite a dearth of fundamental core research that's being done. Mostly how we learn is through clinical experience. And this involves hundreds, if not thousands, of clinicians throughout the country and throughout the world. A lot of trial and error and people sharing in their experiences and consolidating them and finding out those things that work. And in many cases, making significant progress, particularly in areas of like anesthesia, antibiotics, orthopedic surgery. It was dependent upon companies that make things, bringing new agents and materials out to the market that we could access and have available to us to learn how to apply in various ways to our work with the birds. So in that vein, one of the principal things that helped move the whole business of avian medicine along was the forming of the Association of Avian Veterinarians, which was organized in 1982 with the goals of education, research, and conservation of birds. They have a journal of peer-reviewed literature, as you can see here, and also do an annual conference. And so that gave us an opportunity to mix up with other people, learn from other people in a very handy way. And also, as time went on and we started developing techniques and procedures, we would go back to the annual meeting of this and conduct wet labs and teach other people what we had learned, primarily in the area of orthopedic surgery. Also in this time, other organizations such as the National Wildlife Rehabilitation Association and International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council and a few others were organized. And so this brought a whole body of people that were working with other species besides raptors into the fray. And there was a lot of crossover and crosstalk among us that helped advance the whole thing. As I say, wildlife rehabilitation kind of became a thing in the 1980s. And we were part of that wave. Okay, well, this is a busy slide, but it intends to give you a timeline of how things happened. And I'm just going to quickly run through this. The items that are listed in red are either very important, and I've mentioned them already, or we'll be talking about them a little bit more as time goes on here. But starting with our founding in 1974, we actually moved into this building here when it was completed in 1976 and occupied a good portion of the second floor of that for surgery suites and for rooms for taking care of birds. In 1978, we had the first Raptor Biomedicine Conference in London. We also in that year had our first international interns, two gentlemen from France that came over and spent the summer with us. And they were the beginning of a flood of folks that came to us from all over the world, over 300 from about 30 different countries over time as things went on. And that got to be quite a great part of our program and gave us global exposure. 1982, as I mentioned, the Association of Veterinarians was formed. 86 was the introduction of isoflurane anesthesia. Take isoflurane anesthesia for granted these days, but let me tell you what, back in the day when all you had was a little ketamine or some methoxyflurane, now having an agent like isoflurane available was a game changer. I'll talk about that in a minute. So it's kind of funny here. 1987 was enrofloxacin, one of the fluoroquinolone antibiotics, Baytril, became available. This was also a game changer because now we had an antibiotic that could be given orally. It was effective against a wide range of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. Birds tolerated it very well, and it was really, really effective. So effective that in time, the running joke was, oh, we need to treat that bird's Baytril deficiency. And it's still useful today. The bugs haven't figured out how to get resistant to it yet, too badly, I don't think, anyway. In 88, we had the second International Raptor Biomedicine Conference or Symposium. This one we organized and held here in Minneapolis. And in that same year, we had the completion of the Raptor Center. And in fact, it was right about this time of the year in October in 1988 that we moved into this building. Again, a huge game changer. In 89, oops, back up here. We had this outbreak, an epidemic of lead poisoning in trumpeter swans. Now, Carol Henderson at the DNR, non-game wildlife manager, was trying to reintroduce trumpeters to the state of Minnesota and had been doing so for several years. But one of the things they ran into right off the bat was swans like to, with their long necks, like to run around in the bottom of waterways, rivers and lakes and things like that, picking up tubers and other stuff that they eat. Well, our waterways are just covered with a blanket of shotgun pellets from being hunted over for 150 years or more. They would eat these pellets and get lead poisoning. So at one time we had almost the entire population of Minnesota swans in the Raptor Center, and we were treating them for lead poisoning. Charles Carrot what was the program, On the Road out of New York. He and some other nationally known news types came out. This was quite a big deal, and documented all that and broadcast this. And that helped a lot again with our national exposure. Another game changer here. So 1990 was the introduction of Sporanox. This is relative to aspergillosis. This is one of the first drugs that we had that was actually effective against that. And we started using that. That helped. Didn't completely take care of the problem, but it helped us get a long ways. In about 1997, orthopedic surgery in the form of external fixation was reimagined. And what we developed from that was change the face of orthopedic surgery in birds. 98, we had our third Raptor Biomedicine conference, this one in South Africa. Also in 1998, the peregrine falcon was removed from the endangered species list. So while all this was going on here in the clinic, we were also involved in doing restoration work on bringing peregrine falcons back. And we now have about 80 pair here nesting in Minnesota in the places where they used to nest, and about 200 pairs in the upper Midwest. We have a very large and stable population of them now. 2002, we had the West Nile virus outbreak. This was quite an experience here. We had a mosquito-borne virus that was very deadly for a lot of species of raptors, and first time we really had to face an epidemic of a disease like that, and a lot of birds came in as a result of that, and it's still with us to this day. Also in 2002, we had the introduction of yet another azole agent, voriconazole, for treating aspergillosis, and this one actually turned out to be a game changer, and I'll talk about that in a minute. 2009, we finally got a digital X-ray unit. Prior to that time, we'd been using conventional film X-rays, which were good as far as they went, but digital X-rays really changed the program. That came to us from an outside grant. I can't remember who, but Julie Ponder was very instrumental in getting that to happen. And it was a very, very good thing for the Raptor Center. 2007, the bald eagle was removed from the endangered species list. 2010, we had the Galapagos Hawk Project. Again, Dr. Ponder was involved in that, as well as Lori Arndt. And this involved maintaining Galapagos hawks in captivity for an extended period of time while they were island conservation was eradicating rats from the island. And that's another whole story that Julie can tell some other time, and she already has. But it was a matter of international involvement on the international scene for the Raptor Center. 2011, of note, at that time, Raptor Center admitted its 20,000th patient, which was a red tail. And we go here to 2015, we had our first influenza outbreak. This was a low-path influenza that was affecting waterfowl and turkeys. Didn't do too much to raptors. And then in 2022, we had the second outbreak of avian influenza, which is still going on right now. This was a high-path virus that is very serious for raptors and affected operations at TRC quite substantially. And in 2024, Raptor Center count now stood at 32,400 patients. So that's quite a bit of work. And this is the short list. We could go on and on and on, but there just isn't time to do it. But these are some of the highlights along our timeline, give you an idea of how we progressed. These were a couple of books that were published as a result of the conferences and symposia that we had. The Minneapolis conference in 1988 resulted in the publication of Raptor Biomedicine. And then the South Africa conference was this one here, Raptor Biomedicine 3. And this is a compilation of a lot of medicine things as well as conservation issues affecting and involving raptors that were brought forward by people from across and around the world. Back to the Raptor Center building for a minute. I just can't go on and absolutely must acknowledge and express an appreciation to the generosity of Donna and Louise Gabbard, who conceived the idea of building a building for us and then went ahead and donated the money to do it. About $2.38 million to build the building back in the day. And the doors of this opened in 1988. That was the building, and it was wonderful. Interestingly enough, this building was where it is right now. There used to be just a row of chicken coops on that hillside there. So I think that land has been repurposed to a higher order at this stage. Another huge contributor to the Raptor Center over time has been Doug and Wendy. He went beyond and donated just shy of $1 million that was spent equipping and furnishing the building. Basically, we had a shell. We had to get some stuff in there. So he contributed a lot of money for that. He also later on came on and endowed the Redig Chair in Avian Medicine and Conservation here at the College of Veterinary Medicine. And then he also contributed money to build the current Dayton Education Wing at the center. So huge supporter of the Raptor Center. And beyond that, we've had a lot of other patrons and supporters for the Raptor Center. One of my favorite here is Kitty Anderson from the Anderson Window Company over in Bayport. 96 years old there, and she's taking a bald eagle out of my hands to release it. She was a spunky woman, let me tell you. So that was great. We also had Wally and Mary Lee Dayton. Doug and Wally were members of 5 brothers that originally developed Dayton's department stores. I know if you noticed on my previous slide too, I just had a little note at the bottom. Doug was also the founder of Target stores, Target Corporation. And through his involvement with Target was a great supporter of the Raptor Center for many years back in the 90s. Bob and Carol Berry. Bob is a falconer friend of mine from Wyoming, a rancher out there. He continues to support the Raptor Center. Paul Verrett at St. Paul Foundations, along with support from the Ordways, Wirehouses, and a lot of other wealthy people in the Twin Cities area. And the point I want to make is that, philanthropy is key to the Raptor Center operations. And the philanthropy that exists here in the Twin Cities doesn't happen anyplace else in the country. And that is really one of the reasons why we have this center here and why it's successful, is because we have people here that value the environment, they value our lifestyles here, they value our birds, and are willing to put money into it. But again, the philanthropy is key. And that's my shameless plug for the development partner here. But anyway. So just give you some examples of the types of problems that we were dealing with. Well, here's a bald eagle that got hung up on the mirror of a logging truck over in Wisconsin. His face got beat up pretty bad. But vehicle collisions are one of the principal causes of injury at the Raptor Center. Window collisions are right up there. And then there's shooting. You can see all the shotgun pellets in this eagle here. Getting caught in steel jaw traps. This is one of the problems that we addressed early on. And actually got legislation that changed the way trappers can use traps to prevent eagles getting caught in them. And then there's just a whole miscellaneous things that I won't go into in any detail, but power lines and electrocution, pesticides, and then just everything. Kites, fishing string, Christmas tree lights, barbed wire, soccer nets. You put it out there, a bird's going to get wrapped up in it. Here was a young bald eagle that was brought to us by a bander who encountered it when he's in the nest. It's got a Lindy rig hanging out of its mouth. You can see the spinner down here in its stomach. And just anything we put out there in the environment, they're going to get into it one way or another sooner or later and are being negatively impacted by it. If we look at it, just a graph of our admission causes, this is probably a little hard to make sense of entirely, but a couple things I want to point out. If you look at shooting here, that's this purple thing right here. And for many, many years, it's been right at around 5%. So even though birds are protected, they still get shot. That's not terribly surprising. But the good news there is when we first started out, about 35% of our admissions were due to birds that had been shot. So we'll take that as a win. Similarly, trapping, it was about 10%, and this was almost entirely bald eagles, although some great horned owls and occasionally red tails that get caught in traps, but that's down around 1% or less. Used to be around 10%. We have a group in here around 13% that are orphans. These are just birds that people find and bring into us, and we try to get them back out to the nest as much as we can. Usually there's not too much has to be done with them. The big percentage here, this 53%, this is just miscellaneous trauma, and that harkens back to the slide that I just showed you a minute ago. It covers everything. The point of all this is that traumatic injury is the #1 cause of admission to the Raptor Center. But it's not just traumatic injury, because invariably it's complicated by a whole host of other things, including dehydration, emaciation. Oftentimes they have a little bit of lead poisoning floating around in there, especially if they're an eagle. And then just the stress of captivity. These are wild animals, and we're bringing them into these crazy places that they've never seen before. And the stress factor is just huge. And then along with that, we have diseases such as aspergillosis, malaria, West Nile that may or may not be accompanying these traumatic injuries. But anyway, it's quite a diagnostic dilemma that we have to deal with, separating these things out and deciding what you can treat, what you can't treat, and how you're going to handle the whole case in a holistic sort of way so that you're addressing all of the problems that they are facing. So with those thoughts in mind, I just want to take a little finer look at the developments of some of these things. And I'll talk again about our anesthesia journey. I'm not going to say anything about clinical pathology at this point, but I do want to get onto ASPR, orthopedic surgery, lead poisoning, and some new challenges that are out there right now. So as I mentioned, when we started out, anesthesia, I mean, anesthesia is fundamental to working with birds. Working with any animals in the veterinary sense, you got to be able to anesthetize them. And in birds, it even goes more beyond that, because as we found later on, particularly with the availability of isoflurane, if you just want to handle a bird, you want to knock it down, so it relieves the stress on the bird while you're handling it. And so it's a great adjunct in that fashion. But when we started out, the drug we had, anesthesia, was equithezin. As the name suggests, it's for horses. But it was the combination of magnesium sulfate, chlorohydrate, and pentobarbital. I regard it as being just one step above euthanasia solution. But it's what we had. And you knock a bird down with this, and they would probably be out for 15 to 20 hours. Long time. Needless to say, the mortality with that was somewhat substantial. But we quickly got ahead of that, and ketamine has just become available in 1970. And so from about 1972 through 1975, I was doing some of this work back in my basement at home before we brought the work down here to the campus. But we were using combinations of ketamine and Valium. And in fact, the first paper that we published was our protocol for using ketamine and Valium in anesthetized birds. Worked pretty good, but it was supplanted in time by replacing the Valium with a drug called Rompin, xylazine. And we used that extensively from 1975 up to about 1986. And it worked pretty good. In fact, for our purposes at the time, when we had our operation working out of this building, radiology was over in the small animal clinic next door. And so we wanted to take radiographs on birds. We'd anesthetize them here. We'd take a whole bunch of them, wrap them up in towels like cordwood, and carry them over and do the x-rays that we needed to do for that day. But the injectable anesthetic was very good for that. And with care and learning the species differences, and they were substantial from one species to another in terms of what the dosing was, we were able to effect a pretty good level of anesthesia for the work that we were doing. But again, the problem is with any injectable anesthetic is you put it in, it's in there, you can't get it back out. You just got to keep the bird alive until it can metabolize it out, and hopefully it all ends up really well. Along the way, we did use a little bit of methoxyfluorine, moderately useful, but generally poor, and highly soluble in blood, and it stays in the body once it's there, and so it's very hard to regulate it. Halothane, we used a little bit of it. That's very dangerous. It causes a sensitization of the myocardium, and you get a lot of arrhythmias and sometimes just heart stoppages from the use of that. Finally, in 1986, isoflurane was introduced, and that was just a game changer. Now we had an agent that you could take, put the mask over the bird's head, a minute and a half later, it'd be completely anesthetized. You could intubate it, and if you wanted to keep it down for 3.5 hours or 4 hours, you could do it, as long as you maintained it, the ventilation. And take the stuff off, they were back up on their feet in 2 or 3 minutes. It was fantastic. And so that really revolutionized our role. So we went from ketamine to Rompin, with Rompin with Rompin here, and then down to isoflurane. And that really changed our operation and made it much more possible to do what we needed to do. Radiology, again, like anesthesia, it's an essential assessment tool for evaluating traumatically injured animals. As I mentioned before, in the early days, we had to carry the animals over next door to the small animal clinic for radiology. Originally, when we built the Raptor Center, we had conventional radiology installed there. Digital radiology was still 20 years out. And it served us well, but we had these vast shelves full of x-rays that we had to maintain and go back and find sometimes if we needed them for something. But our digital unit was acquired in 2009. And again, that really changed the way we could do radiographs and restore them and recover them for studies and things like that. And so that was a huge thing. And the nice thing about the radiology unit over in the Raptor Center now is we have it, it's right between our admissions area and our surgery suite. So at the time of admission, we can have them down on the table, anesthetized or not, as the case may be, run in there, take whatever films we need, come back out and continue. And we're doing surgery, orthopedic surgery, we can stop in the middle of it, pick the bird up, take it over to radiology and check things out and see how we are. It's really, really convenient and very, very helpful. Aspergillosis. All right, so here's a disease agent that's unique to birds. But it's a huge problem. As Jamie Seymour wrote in his book, it is really the most common occurring disease among captive raptors. And it's very common among wild raptors that are brought into captivity, particularly for purposes such as ours. It's a disease of the respiratory system caused by this ubiquitous fungus, Aspergillus fumigatus. Looks like this on a sabrodextrose plate. And that's what the organism is under a microscope. It's ubiquitous. It's in this room. You're breathing it. Doesn't bother us. We have pulmonary macrophages that eliminate that thing. Birds don't. And beyond that, stress is part of the pathology of this disease. Stressed birds are more susceptible to it, and our birds are by definition stressed, so that adds to the problem. We get varying presentations of it depending on the host and the size of the exposure. In other words, the number of spores that they inhale, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. Diagnosis is difficult, and both diagnosis and treatment is difficult. And in fact, in the initial stages of aspergillosis, even though it is a disease of the respiratory system, for the first few days that the bird has it, it might not show any respiratory signs at all. It probably won't. What you might see is a bird that just doesn't want to eat or just doesn't feel good or something like that. And it's not immediately clear what's going on. Why is that important? Because the delay in time between you first think a bird might have aspergillosis and when you can have a definitive diagnosis of it based on culture, laboratory analysis, something like that, that might be several days. That's enough to lose the case. And so we had to back up and really look at what those very subtle signs are that birds are showing us that indicate they might have aspergillosis. We call it clinical suspicion, but that was very key to successful management once we had drugs that were capable of actually dealing with this bug. And beyond that, like any other disease, prevention is key to management, and we have to go to extensive measures in order to achieve that. So these are just some ugly pictures. I won't dwell on these very much, but these are just some of what you get with aspergillosis. This is a pair of lungs from a golden eagle that had an acute exposure, and might be able to see the little nodules all through the lung here, just totally destroyed the lung parenchyma. That that's a dead bird. You can't treat that. It's way far gone by the time they present, and that only takes a couple days for that to develop. All the rest of these here are chronic disease, granulomas and nodules forming throughout the lungs and the air sacs and in the body. Sometimes just open growing mold like this. These take days, sometimes weeks to develop. And depending on when you make the diagnosis and intervene on it and the severity of it and a whole bunch of other factors, you may have some modicum of success in treating it. But suffice it to say, our birds coming in with all their injuries and their stress and things like that are terribly susceptible to it, and it was a real big problem. So our success in conquering this disease was achieved by, first of all, being able, with some degree of precision, predict which species and which individuals were likely to develop the disease in our situation. Red-tailed hawks, goshawks, and gyrfalcons come out at the top. Other raptors also can have it, but these are the ones that get it the most time. The thing I always questioned in my mind, always wondered about, we don't see aspergillosis in owls. Why? If we could figure that out, maybe we'd be able to figure out something about why these other birds actually get it. But I think it's an interesting question. One of the mainstays of our prevention was a program of prophylactic treatment. And this basically involved giving an antifungal drug to a bird, particularly one of ours with a high level of susceptibility, for about 3 weeks after admission, 2 to 3 weeks after admission. And this really drove down the occurrence of aspergillosis in our patients over time. In other cases, you know, we were beyond this period and you're just concerned about disease developing. Our early detection really depends upon our clinical suspicion, number one, based on species and circumstances of the bird. And then hematology is very valuable. These birds all have a very profound heterophilia. And serum chemistry, very simply, actually, all we're doing is total solids on a refractometer, but as that total protein goes up due to the production of antibodies, it's a good indicator of the fact that the bird has it. And then we can confirm by endoscopy if needed and find all the little fuzzies growing around there in the air sacs, and that'll tell us what we need to know. But the important thing here is that to deal with this disease, and we learned, is that you have to initiate treatment at the time of clinical suspicion, not 4, 5, or 6 days later. You got to get on it right away. And if it turns out the bird doesn't have aspergillosis, no harm done, stop the drugs, move on. Now, this is another one of these situations where our ability to deal with it was dependent upon new things becoming available in the course of time. Originally, thibendazole, which is a sheep wormer, was known to have some antifungal activity, but it turned out it was not clinically useful. It just wasn't that good. Amphotericin B was the standard for antifungal therapy in humans in particular through the 1950s and up through about the 1980s. But unfortunately, that drug has to be given either by intravenous administration or has to be nebulized, put into a vapor that is the birds breathe. We never found it very effective in dealing with aspergillosis in birds. But there was a progression of other azole drugs beyond thibendazole in the 80s and 90s. And the first one that really showed us some promise was this drug called clotrimazole, which was suspended in propylene glycol. We could nebulize that, and either we got lucky or we actually treated a few cases and it might have worked. It was kind of that sort of thing, but we thought we had something going there. However, later on in the 90s, itraconazole or Sporanox became available again from Janssen Pharmaceutical. And this was a genuine antifungal drug. It worked. Not all the time, but enough that we could at least get a modicum of success with it. And it became our mainstay for this prophylactic treatment of aspergillosis in birds. Finally, in about right around 2000, another azole, voriconazole or VFend, again an oral drug, became available, and this one was different. This would really kill asper. It was well tolerated by the birds, and in a very short time, it supplanted all other forms of antifungal therapy, and we were achieving about a 70 to 80% success rate with that if we initiated treatment at the time of clinical suspicion. Not waiting till the bird is gasping for air and then start treating it. No, right now, first time you think about it, start treatment. So that worked pretty good, and that was a relief. All right, we'll leave that behind now and just talking a little bit about the development of our orthopedics. This was critical to our operation because with traumatic injuries, an awful lot of our birds had broken bones of one sort or another. And honestly, for the first 20 years, we relied on kind of conventional techniques that were available for small animals. They consisted of various types of bandaging and casts and splints, as well as external skeletal fixation, just pins that are put in through the bones and held together with a rod and some clamps. And then to the extent that we did any internal fixation, we used conventional intramedullary Steinman pins, just a stainless steel rod that was put in the bone. Or we got to using a kind of a unique thing here of polypropylene shuttle pins that were placed inside the marrow cavity of the bone. I remind you, if you don't already know this, that for the most part, bird bones are hollow, so there's a nice large cavity that you can stick something into there. And we would embed those in bone cement. Yeah, they kind of work, but all of these were, our success rate was ranging in 25 to 30% on orthopedics. Not really great, but it was what we had to work with. Then we reimagined this, and this was kind of an interesting process that we ended up through, but we developed or ultimately arrived at this thing here that's called a tie-in fixator. And it's called a tie-in fixator because the internal element here, the intramedullary pin, is tied to the external skeletal fixator components here, these two pins here that are driven through the bone. And then this whole works is tied together with a acrylic bar. And so here it is applied to the ulna of a bald eagle. You can see the one pin here, the other pin is down there, and then here's the connector, the tie-in bar right there into the intramedullary pin. Well, this is a fairly novel approach. In fact, this was one of those dogma things because I remember a couple orthopedic surgeons that I actually suggested this to early on and said, no, you can't do that. You're going to get the best of both worlds, the worst of both worlds if you do that. The worst of an IM pin and the worst of an external fixator. Not going to work, not going to work. Well, it took a while to overcome that, and we finally did. In fact, that it worked really, really well. And I'll show you some more about that in a minute. But it was ideally suited for use in birds because we're working with birds that range from 60 grams in weight, like a saw-whet owl, all the way up to 5,000 gram bald eagle. And we needed a technique and a methodology that would be able to span that range of sizes. So, and this did, just by choice and selection of the pins that you use. Secondly is the malleability. Birds' bones are oftentimes curved, and we had to have some fixator that we could work around that would follow those curves. And then lastly, and this is near and dear to my heart, it was cheap. And it had to be cheap because we wanted to be able, we needed to do this a lot. And you got about less than $10 tied up in materials here for this fixator. And if we wanted to export it to all these other rehabilitation clinics that were coming online around the country, they don't have any money to work with. They could not be spending $800 or $1,000 for a plate to put in there. And beyond that, plates are horribly invasive in their application. And birds have very little soft tissue over their bones in most cases. And that installation of those was going to be problematic. So this kind of checked all the boxes here in terms of things that made it work for us. But again, we couldn't do that earlier in the game because the hardware that we needed to do that didn't become available until 1995. And what changed it, what was the game changer there was IMEX Veterinary Surgical Supply in Longview, Texas. And they came out with this great little set of orthopedic pins and other equipment ranging from 0.035, very tiny little pin, up through 0.78 and beyond. And these are just exactly in the size range that we needed to use in birds up through the size of red-tailed hawks. For bigger birds, eagles, we use a 3/16 inch pin. Beyond that, the neat thing about them is they had a very sharp point on them, or a trocar, and then the end of it had what we call a positive profile threaded pin. So the thread was larger than the diameter of the pin itself. So you could bore these things into a bone without pre-drilling it. They would anchor in the bone and they would hold very, very tight. In the old days of external fixation, where we used smooth pins without threads on them and put them in at angles, it was a race between the healing of the bone and when the fixator fell apart. These things, you could put them on, they stayed on for weeks if need be. They were solid, they did not come apart, they did not come off. So there was an external fixator course put together by IMEX and a few other orthopedic surgeons in Athens, Georgia in 1998. I attended that and was just totally blown away by what they were teaching us. So we brought those concepts back to the Raptor Center and began a process of adaptation to birds, refinement, and finally put it together in a book. So just expanding on that theme a little bit, because I think this really kind of excites. It's simple, and that's part of it. It's elegant by virtue of its simplicity, and also by the fact that it really, really works well. And the reason it works is because what we create with this thing is an I-beam. Like here. So you've got two parallel members here and a shear web between them, and it stops all the forces that are applied to a bone. Bending forces, rotational forces, compression forces, extraction forces, the whole 9 yards. And that's what you need in order to get a bone to heal. And none of the other devices that we used in the past were able to do that. You know, if you go into any big box store and look up at the ceiling, what are you going to see up there? You're going to see I-beams. They're the strongest structural thing there is, I think. Daryl, you can dispute that with me if you want to, but there we go. But anyway, it worked great. And that was really the key to making this thing, conceptually, the thing that made this thing work for us. So just to give you an example, I think this is an extreme example, but it shows what you can do with it. This. So here's a bald eagle radiograph, been hit by car, and it has bilateral femoral fractures. One here and one right there. Now they're bipeds like we are. They need 2 legs in order to stand. Break both legs, you got a problem. We've got a bigger problem with them because they're not going to lay on their back or any other configuration to get the weight off the legs. They've got to be able to use their legs from the get-go, day 1 following surgery. So here's our tie-in fixator applied to both legs. You see the intramedullary pin here. You can see the external fixator pins, and you can see the acrylic bar here that ties this all together. This is 10 days post-operatively here. And then here we are at 32 days, a little over 4 weeks. One leg is healed already, and the hardware has been removed. The other one is well on its way and just needs a few more days to heal. What I was really proud about on this particular case was this was done by one of our students, Dr. Irene Bueno. So she was like one of many students that had come to the Raptor Center. She had spent time with us. She learned how to do this thing and was independently able to take this case on and manage it beautifully from the get-go. And the result was a bald eagle with 2 good legs under it. 8 weeks later, all hardware removed, little reconditioning, Lori's shop, and it was ready to go again. So that was great. The other thing about this technique is it's versatile. You could apply it in lots of different situations. One of our most difficult fractures are these distal fractures here, particularly on the humerus. We could whip something together that looked like this. Here's a red tail, the distal humeral fracture. Use a little different configuration of pins, but still the same basic idea is you have a bar here and intramedullary pins holding it all together. And you get down the road about 3 weeks and it's healed. All the hardware comes off and away she goes. Bird bones heal really fast. That's one of the really great things for us. So anyway, just to kind of in summary on that, this really approaches an ideal fixation mode because it opposes all of the forces that are applied to a broken bone. It's minimally invasive. You only have 3 small entry points where you're putting these pins through the skin and into the bone. Easy peasy. It doesn't hurt the bird up otherwise. Plus the pins can be placed, particularly these ESF pins, a long ways away from the injury site, so you're not damaging soft tissue. And so there's just some other aspects of it here. I won't spend much time talking about, but one of the other pieces I like about it is that all the hardware is removed at the time of completion, and it's very easy to remove. So there's not any further trauma associated with that. Our success rate went up to between 60 and 70% for fractures from a 25 to 30 once we started applying this method. So we were happy with that. Well, we figured we had something going, so we began on a kind of what I call orthopedic evangelism. And so this technique is now taught to all U of M vet students that go through here if they take our bird courses. In addition, we've done wet labs in the US at the Association of Avian Veterinary meetings. Myself, Dr. Ponder, and Dr. Daniel have all been out and continuing these things. They've been going on for about the last 30 years. So hundreds and hundreds of veterinarians are learning how to do this. Also other organizations, same thing. And we've gone international with it, and we've presented this at wet labs in a number of countries throughout Europe. This was a meeting in Zurich, Switzerland back in 2007. We were teaching it. So, you know, it extends the role of the Raptor Center and on a global basis in not only doing the things here, but also teaching it to other people so we can amplify the scale of the work. And then finally, we put this all together in a book. It's published just 2023, about 20 years in the making. It's got 423 pages in it, and it's full of radiographic following of cases. So we've got every x-ray taken on the bird, and we usually x-ray them almost every week. So they got from beginning to end on all these cases. So practitioners can look at this and just follow the case through and see what happened and duplicate the repair if they are presented with such a case. This is augmented. We have three authors on this: Susan Oras, who is an anatomist, and Scott Eccles, who's a practitioner out in Salt Lake City, a very progressive individual, lots of crazy ideas about how to do things. And so Susan has her section in here on anatomy, which was the original anatomy book on avian anatomy written back in the early 70s. And then Scott put all of these, if I can find a page here. Now these are types of drawings from Susan's on her anatomy here. And then Scott did a contrast. He had some access to some interesting equipment where he could put all these digitally color all of the bones and things like that and make the anatomy easy to go, easy to understand. And then there's also vascular images here someplace, which I can't find. Here we go, this sort of thing here. So we see what the vascular patterns are on a number of different species of birds. Anyway, it's a kind of a documentary work, and I think will stand to be a useful thing for years and years to come. We put a couple copies of this up in the Vet Red Library, and I'm donating a copy of this here to the Veterinary Medicine Historical Museum, so that'll be here. And you can also purchase it if you wish. Okay, so beyond that, one other thing, this really killed me here. Some years ago, the university was putting together what they call their wall of discovery over Minneapolis. So they were trying to engrave in stone, literally, some of the big things that happened here at the university over time. And the committee approached me and they said, hey, we think that fixator that you have designed and work with is really, really cool. We'd like to include it. And I said, really? They said, yeah, just send us some drawings from your notebooks or something about the development stages of it. And so I said, well, okay, whatever. I did. I sent them this, just on a yellow pad. Well, there it is. It's now engraved in stone on the university's wall of discovery over in Minneapolis, along with heart-lung machines and stuff that are really useful to a lot of people. Anyway, beyond that, so lead. Okay, I call this a continuing train wreck because we have been dealing with lead from day one. Didn't realize it was lead at the beginning, but it soon came to that point. This is me about 40 years and 40 pounds ago. And you can see there's an eagle. This is actually a mildly affected bird. He's blind and totally unresponsive to, and you can't normally walk up to an eagle and do that. But it just shows you how kind of out of it he is. And I hope that someday we will have eliminated lead. And we're still working on it. We're not even close yet, but we're getting there. And there's some things that have happened that are optimistic. The problem, of course, originally was thought to be, and this is back in the 70s and 80s when bald eagles were at the absolute low, they were being found with lead poisoning. And it was believed that shotgun pellets embedded in the flesh of dabbling ducks that were not recovered in the field were being eaten by eagles. And then this ended up with them getting lead poisoning. Well, this ended up in a lawsuit by the National Wildlife Federation against the Fish and Wildlife Service for not taking action against eliminating shotgun pellets from the food that eagles were consuming. They won the lawsuit, and by 1986, the Fish and Wildlife Service required that non-lead shot be used for all waterfowl hunting on federal land. There's a five-year phase-in period to that went out to 1991, and then several states, including Minnesota, adopted similar legislation right off the bat. okay, well and good, but we were still getting lead poisoned eagles in, and we published this paper in 1997, which covered the period between 1980 and 1995, so kind of before and after the implementation of the lead shot regulations. And what was interesting is if we just looked at the incidence of the percentage of eagles that were being admitted with lead poisoning, here's the dividing line here in 1991, before and after, up through 1995, which is as far as we were able to go at that time, it doesn't look any different. Like, what the heck? Well, so then we look at the timing, the temporal relationship of this, the timing of it. What we notice is that you kind of bobble through the year here, but you see this big rise here, both before and after, in October and November, December, and then kind of dribbles through January and February, and then another little blip here in March. We started thinking, and this, started thinking about maybe deer are the issue. And the insight for this actually came from my work with the California condor recovery team, because they were having a lot of problems with lead poisoning in condors. In fact, lead is probably the thing that caused a condor to crash in the first place 50 years ago. But regardless, we kind of brought that idea home and started thinking about it. Well, if we look at the data a little differently here, just plot it starting with July and go through the summer, get October when the small game and waterfowl season opens. There's a little bit of a blip. This is probably shotgun pellets here. But then the firearm deer season opens in Minnesota and Wisconsin here in November. And we start seeing our lead poisoning cases go up. It peaks in December and then comes back a little bit and drops off. And then with the spring thaw, when the snow goes away and carcasses that are not recovered become visible, the eagles start getting into them again. And, you know, between Minnesota and back in, especially in the 80s and 90s, there was about 400,000 deer killed in Minnesota and Wisconsin in a couple-week period. And all those deer are gutted out in the field. The gut piles are left there. And then beyond that, you still have the deer that are wounded and get away and die. But either way, whether it's a gut pile or a wounded deer that dies, it's a party. The crows and the ravens find these things first, but they make a lot of racket, and the eagles tune in on that, and pretty soon they show up at the carcass and away they go. One of the things that we noted about this, it's always adult bald eagles. Always adults, never immatures. Well, I think the adults reign supreme at a carcass feeding situation like that, and the kids stay out of there if they're going to get beat up. But the upshot of this is that the birds that are dying are the adult breeding population. And if you want to really have an impact on a population, kill off your adult breeding population. There's a lot more youngsters around than there's adults. And it takes about 5 to 7 years for an eagle to mature to the point where it can actually start laying eggs. Well, we hypothesized that bald eagles feeding on these carcasses and residues were ingesting lead. And we were able to confirm that in many cases that was the case, because we would flush their stomachs and we'd get deer hair and we would get lead fragments coming out at the same time. And so it was a real insidious problem. If you look at the scale of it, this just a cohort of eagles that we looked at that had been admitted at the Raptor Center between 1986 and 2016. There were 2,200 birds in that total cohort. Of those 220, 550 of them came in with lead poisoning as their primary diagnosis. Nothing else. No fractures, no injuries, no nothing, just flat out lead poisoning. And of those 550, 482 of them, or 88%, died. In fact, most of them were euthanized, because you can tell when an eagle's got severe lead poisoning and it's not humane to let them die from it. But in any case, that's a very high mortality rate. I mean, for the most part, it's an untreatable disease when it advances to the point where the bird is debilitated with lead. The other piece of information here is that because of the prevalence of lead poisoning in eagles, nowadays and for quite some time, every eagle that comes into the Raptor Center is tested for lead. And what we find is that 80%, and actually it's over 80% of all eagles, no matter what the cause of admission, have elevated lead residues in their blood. So it's a problem. It's a huge problem. Now, the only treatment we have for this is calcium EDTA, which we give subcutaneously. In lower cases with lower lead levels that are not so clinical, up to about 0.5 part per million, a little bit better, you can oftentimes chelate them and nominally treat them. We believe we treat them. And some of them even get released again, but anything beyond that, they're goners. Well, we're trying to get a solution for this, and historically, we have the legislation going on for the banning of lead shot for waterfowl. That didn't go over very well with the hunting community, but they had to accept it because it was being enforced. We come around late on and say, guys, you know, it wasn't really the waterfowl, or at least they were only a real small piece of it. The big problem is with deer. and now we want you to start using non-toxic ammunition for hunting deer. Well, we have tried repeatedly a number of different approaches to bring that into play, and it's just not working. But we do have a clear relationship between deer hunting and lead poisoning established. Attempts at legislation have been thwarted by the NRA entirely here in the state of Minnesota. And so we moved to a more voluntary approach for using alternative ammunitions. And nowadays there are quite an abundance of copper bullets out there that are really, really effective. They're a little more expensive, but most deer hunters will tell you, if they're honest about it, they only shoot 2 or 3 shots a year anyway at the deer. So what, they spend more on their coffee on the way out to the field than they do for ammunition. So this approach here with workshops and dialogue with hunters, appealing to the conservation ethics, doing things like shooting clinics and live fire demonstrations to try to get hunters to come on board with this. It hasn't really been realized yet. I'll just quickly run through this. These shooting demonstrations are really interesting. What they did is they put a bunch of milk bottles filled with water inside a plastic barrel like this, and you'd shoot into that barrel and then collect the lead fragments. Here's yours truly taking a shot with a Winchester 270 with a lead bullet. Anyway, what you find is that darn lead bullet just going through water fragments like this. Here's the copper jacket around it, and here's all the lead fragments. And you drain the barrel and you find all those pieces in it. Well, that's only part of it, because here's the rest of it. Here's those little tiny pieces, some of them almost microscopic, that you find around the bottom of the barrel. Okay? And a study done by the DNR here using sheep carcasses found that these fine grains, as well as some of the bigger fragments, disperse widely from the wound site. So think about it. You guys are here deer hunting, and your hamburger's got a lot of this lead in it because you can't see it, but it's there because these bullets leave a big track of lead behind it. Well, that's what the eagles are eating. Now, in contrast, if you shoot a copper bullet at milk bottles, it makes a hell of a big splash, but there's the bullet. It didn't fragment. Everything is right there, and copper's non-toxic anyway. And it shoots well. Here's a 4-shot grouping at 100 yards with a 30-30 copper bullet. They're deadly accurate, high muzzle velocities. They kill better than lead does. You'd think that would solve the problem, but nope. So to be continued, but we really need to work towards getting rid of lead ammunition and lead fishing tackle. I think the worldwide threat to wildlife from lead is just incredible. Okay, I'm running a little bit long here, but I just want to go through one more thing here with you. Most recently, and I wasn't part of this because I'd long since retired, but avian influenza has gotten to be a really big problem. It's a new challenge for the Raptor Center on top of ones that they've already met. So waterfowl are the natural reservoir for influenza type A viruses. And in 2015, you remember on that timeline, I said we had our first influenza outbreak. That killed a lot of turkeys here in Minnesota, about $40 million worth of indemnity to turkey growers. But that was what we call a low path virus that was circulating in wildlife, in waterfowl. It doesn't hurt them. When it got into a novel host, like a turkey or like a raptor, the brakes were off, and now this virus would convert to a high path and cause all kinds of disease. But it was limited. That particular virus originated in Asia, was transported around the world by migrating waterfowl, and targeted domestic poultry, captive raptors used for falconry and breeding, and also large cats in zoos. Interesting. But it disappeared after about a year, and it totally disappeared. I mean, people looked for it. They swabbed all kinds of ducks, couldn't find it. In 2021, it showed up again, but this time it came back as a high path virus. It didn't need to convert. It was a high path virus in wild birds and caused quite a bit of mortality there, but it's really severely, those birds are dying or getting sick, and raptors are feeding on them. And we had a secondary pathogenicity and disease event going on in raptors and domestic poultry. And also, this is the same virus I'm sure you've read about in the news it's infecting cattle. And also now humans that work with cattle are getting infected. The big fear, of course, is that this virus is going to develop the ability in time to jump directly from one human to another. And if you think COVID was a party, wait till you get influenza going. We don't want to have that happen. But this was a huge problem for the Raptor Center. And I thank Dana for providing me with these slides, because I hadn't really seen this myself, but it was just insane, because now they had to go incorporating all kinds of security protocols for handling incoming birds. Required staff to wear hazmat suits, to isolate birds in quarantine situations, protect all the other patients in the hospital, protect all of our education birds over there, and protect human health too. And it's expensive and time consuming, and really added to the burden of working with the birds over there. But in a big picture sense, it had a silver lining to it, because raptors became the surveillance agent for avian influenza. And this was relied upon by the health department and the USDA for getting an idea of how widespread and where the virus was throughout the region. We advanced our knowledge and science of the virus, how it works, and how you can manage it. And of course, we always want to share our experiences with other people. But on a daily basis, people were required to wear PPE. Had to develop a two-stage quarantine protocol. It required extreme disinfection and cleaning and safety protocols, which are still in place at the Raptor Center to this day. If you go over there, you have to wipe your feet on a disinfectant pad on the way through the door. And just what it looks like, well, it's basically looks like a dumpy bird. And in that respect, it's a little hard to differentiate it from a lot of other diseases or neurogenic problems that cause seizures and convulsions, such as West Nile virus, Newcastle disease, even lead poisoning or traumatic head injuries. But here's an eagle with avian influenza here. And it's pretty pathetic, pretty sad seeing. And you have no choice but to euthanize something like that. And of course, that's what happens. So they conducted a study from March through December of 2021, I believe it was, and it was published recently in Pilo Swan here. And this is a small sample of the data, total that they sampled, but if you just, these are the ones that had the most incidence of influenza. So bald eagles at the top of 165 eagles tested, 48 were positive for a total of 29%. Peregrines, 24, 8, of which 8 were positive, 33%. Horned owls actually had the highest incidence of 47%. Now, all of the birds that had clinical signs, all the positive birds had clinical signs, and they either died or were euthanized, except for one great horned owl that managed to recover. Leave it to an owl. But anyway, that was kind of the pattern of what we saw there. So very, very serious disease. And so they had to establish all kinds of protocols for dealing with HPI, and I won't go into that right now. But suffice it to say, we became an integral partner with poultry industry and the state and the USDA for doing influenza surveillance, and really became a global leader in establishing best practices for dealing with influenza outbreaks in the sort of setting that we operate in. So we do just a quick summary of TRC. You know, we were established as a university level center. We built a facility and a program with now a 50-year history, pioneered raptor and avian medicine, became a global leader in those disciplines. We did endangered species restoration for peregrines and bald eagles, reduction of some threats, addressed the lead problem, which is continuing, and really turned public on opinion about raptors and environment, and are poised for continued excellence, in my opinion. But so now what? Well, we still have problems, right? But we have a platform to work from. We have a well-established clinic with procedures and protocols and agents and all the things that we need to do with raptors. And that positions us to go and deal with unknown and pending issues that are coming up, such as emerging diseases, climate change, effects of human population, and so on. And here's the face of the challenge presently. And this is real. Billions of birds have disappeared in the last 30 years. Billions. I've noticed this myself. I went up the Lake of Woods here recently. I drove from here to Baudette. I saw 2 turkey vultures and a couple of crows and some pigeons. That was it. Birds are gone. World Wildlife Fund just reported here on the 10th of October, there has been a 73% decline in the population sizes of terrestrial species, such as birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians in the last 50 years. Are we actually looking at a 6th extinction event? There's already been 5. Some people think so. Climate change is real and it is impacting populations. It is here and it is going to stay here. We can't stop this now. And so further declines are inevitable. So we've got a lot of work to do. So the choice is yours, ours. I'm going to say yours because I'm going to go fishing. I've done this for 50 years, but nonetheless, there's work to be done out there. And most recently, and this just came up here in the last couple of weeks, this is really quite alarming. We put a lot of time into restoring peregrine falcons and bald eagles. It's just been reported now in the last few weeks by people that are conducting long-term observational studies on bald eagles and peregrines. Coastal peregrines in Alaska and the West Coast and the East Coast, there's been about a 50% reduction in nesting occupancy this last spring, 2024. 50%. Presently, our Midwest population, which we monitor closely, appears unaffected, but that's where we are right now. Bald eagles, again, an observer, Bill Bowerman from Maryland, has been studying eagles in southern Michigan for 30 years. And he's reporting significant vacancy rate in 2024. Similarly, Voyageurs Park, similar situation. Dr. Ponder was up there this spring and can report that firsthand for you. And necropsies confirmed HPI in a large number of eagles that they recovered in Michigan. So again, it seems pretty clear that this influenza is affecting them. I think peregrines will probably weather this storm. The ones I'm really worried about bald eagles, because in addition to the influenza itself, they also have to deal with West Nile virus, which is very susceptible to, and lead poisoning. And you add, that's a triple whammy. You add all those together, I think our eagles are going to have some trouble. As I said, I'm going fishing. But back to where we started. The mission of the Raptor Center: ensure the health of raptors in the world we share through teaching, research, and service. So we not only do the rehabilitation work and learn all the stuff we can and teach it to other people, but we have our education department that is going out with birds in front of all kinds of audiences, on-site, off-site, every day of the year, year-round, talking to people about these things. We're trying to engage people, we're trying to empower people, we're trying to get a big cohort of folks together that are connected to the world, to the natural world, feel engagement, and will adjust their lives accordingly. So in closing, I want to just leave you with this thought here. How many have read the book Ishmael? Okay. You need to read this book. It's pretty good. It's a kind of a discourse, fictional, between a caged gorilla that's on his way to dying and a human, talking about the takers and leavers in society. And I think the words kind of explain themselves. But just as the eagle is dying, he leaves a message for his human partner. He says, think about this. With gorilla gone, can there be hope for man? Now, think about this. As apex predators, both humans and eagles and raptors in general share a similar fate. They are one in that fate, but we are the major shareholder. We're pulling the strings, we control what's going on out there just because of who we are and what we are. If we choose to ensure the survival of raptors, which the Raptor Center attempts to do, the human fate and that of the current epoch, the Holocene, may be ensured, of course, until Mother Nature says time is up. I always like the quote from Stephen Jay Gould, a Harvard paleontologist and prolific science writer. He said, when you're thinking about all these things, just remember, Mother Nature bats last. And Mother Nature is a bitch. He said, we would be wise to negotiate with her now while she's still in the mood. He said that back in 1994. Things have just gotten worse since then. But if we choose to ensure the survival of raptors, okay, I already said that. That's the whole point of all that. So the question then can be rephrased, perhaps, if we want to, that if the eagle is gone, can there be hope for man? I hope we don't get to that point. Personally, I cannot imagine a world, and I wouldn't want to live in a world that didn't have eagles and other raptors. And if they go away because of things that we have done, man-made disasters, it's really sad situation. And it may very well affect us long-term. It really kind of, there's an existential component to what I'm talking about here. And that's what drives our work at the Raptor Center. We're looking at the big picture of these things, not just the individual birds that we're taking care of, but this other stuff. I think the other thing that Gould said that really fits here, and it's inspiring, but in kind of a not a very happy sort of way. But he said, you know, in an evolutionary sense, Mother Nature didn't see us coming. She doesn't give a damn that we're here, and she is not going to give a whimper when we're gone. Okay, the point is, we as humans, we are another creature, a product of evolution that's on the face of the earth that is inexplicably intertwined with all other life forms here. But we have the capacity to control the situation. And so we have the responsibility for stewardship and managing that, because Mother Nature doesn't care. She's not going to step in and take care of it for us. We've got to take care of this. So with that thought, thank you so much for your time and attention, and have a good evening.